Okay, so here we go with the second lesson on natural selection, all right? This really is one of the most important concepts in all of biology because it helps determine or it helps explain how things get the way they get. And it's something that we see happening in the real world all the time, and it's very important for a number of reasons. What I want to do is go over again what the nature of natural selection is, what the whole story is. And so we're going to get to the story of the peppered moth, which is kind of a famous example of natural selection in action. But I'm also going to tell about another one or two. And remember, this theory of natural selection, about how things change over time, was the main idea of Charles Darwin. So he is, recognized as the guy who first came up with it. I will tell you the truth of the matter is, if he hadn't come up with it, somebody else will. You know, there's certain theories that like Albert Einstein came up with his ideas that were so original. Who knows if somebody else would have discovered it or not? Or Isaac Newton. Modern physics just might not have ever happened if Newton hadn't thought of that. They were so original. But Darwin, we know for sure somebody else was coming up with the same idea because his name was Wilson, and he communicated with Darwin. And he was younger, and he was about to publish his ideas. And in discussion with Darwin, Darwin said, "Well, yeah, that's the idea I came up with earlier." And Wilson was very nice about it and said, "Oh, okay, I'll let you have priority," they call it, where you come first. And so Darwin is remembered as the guy who came up with it. But if he hadn't, I might have been teaching about a gentleman named Wilson. Okay, so anyway, in kind of review of what we did last lesson, Darwin started out his book, Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, talking about dog breeding and breeding of pigeons and things that we're all very familiar with, farm animals. We know for absolute positive, that things can change over time, that a species can change because if dog breeders have been able to change the species into have different kinds of traits. Now, all the dogs are of a similar species still. They haven't done what's called speciation, where they're gotten so genetically different that they can't interbreed. But from a wolf, you get the variation from a Great Dane to a Chihuahua or a poodle or a wiener dog or a pit bull or a whippet. I mean, all by choosing who the parents are, who gets to breed. And by the breeder selecting the traits, they can change the breed over generations, right? So that's very well known. It happened with food crops. It happened with, cows and stuff of that sort. All right. So what Darwin's idea was, well, what if nature does the same thing? Called it natural selection. And so it's this nature getting to choose who breeds, and can it change the species by having beaks change shape over generations. Now, it's not an individual bird that changes its beak shape. It's just born with whatever beak it has. But if its beak happens to be better than its brothers and sisters, it's more likely to survive and pass that beak shape on to the next generation. The ones that survive get to pass their genes on. Okay, so nature selects who gets to breed and pass its genes on by the one that fits in with the environment, survival of the fittest. Okay, and so what started out as a single type of finch that flew in from South America, it turned into multiple different species of finch depending on what food source was available on that island. The bigger beak, thicker beak, the pointier beak, whatever. Okay, so that was the idea of natural selection. I'm going to want you to write this next part down as notes. Please write this down as notes. Okay, I'm not going to make this one multiple choice. I think some of my lessons, the answers, people have been cutting corners. So take these notes here. Starts out with natural selection. Now, what is required for natural selection? Several things are. One, you have to have variation within the population. If all the babies were exactly the same, then nobody would have one advantage over the other, right? And so you know how it works. You got your parents. You have traits that are very similar to your parents, but your brothers and sisters both have traits that are similar to your parents, but you're not exactly the same as each other unless you're like an identical twin. So there's variation. And it's a genetic thing. Darwin knew nothing about how genetics works, by the way, because it hadn't been discovered yet. But there's this thing called a mutation where you can have a random change, or you could just have changes that are mixed, within the pre-existing gene pool. So variation, you have to have differences in the population. Write that down, okay? And then you also, here's where you get to natural selection. Nature selects. That's why it's called natural selection. Nature selects who will survive based on which have adaptations, that's traits, like long teeth, shape of beak, the shape of the wings or whatever. Nature selects who will survive based on which have adaptations or traits that will help them survive. And that's sometimes called survival of the fittest. Write that down. Okay, if you need more time, pause the video, because we're moving on to the next one. So nature selects who survives, and then, this is really common sense, right? The ones that survive have the babies, and they pass their traits to the next generation. So whatever trait is advantageous, that's the traits that will tend to get passed to the next generation, right? Any traits that the parents might have that, or that the organism has that don't help it survive, will tend to get, no, they won't survive, right? They'll tend to get eliminated. That trait will be removed from the gene pool. So the ones that survive have the babies and pass their traits to the next generation. This is key. This is the secret to how this works. It's all really common sense. It really makes perfect sense when you understand how this works. But it isn't like a mommy, I don't know, a mommy finch says, "Oh, honey, we have food around here that's hard to get into. Let's have babies that have the beak that's like a lot tougher." No, it doesn't happen. It's just by chance. So there is elements of chance involved. By chance, there happens to be one that's born with a beak that's tougher to be able to be better at getting the seeds. But the whole thing isn't just chance. Some people say, how could all this happen just by chance? It's not by chance. It's by selection. The ones that fit survive, and they will pass that thicker beak to the next generation. So as generations go on, the beak will get thicker and thicker and thicker. Now, you can never predict exactly what's going to happen ahead of time, because there's so many variables involved in what happens. But whatever works. That's what it is. Whatever works. That's what's going to be more. There's going to be more of that. Okay. So the next step, after many generations, the traits accumulate in the population, so the species changes over time. Right? This actually can happen fairly quickly in just a few generations, but to have big changes happen, it takes lots of generations. Okay? And so please write these 4 down. I'm going to tell you right now, the question's going to be what were the 4 steps? It's not multiple choice. If somebody didn't write these down, you better pause it and write it down now, because that's going to be the question. You got to write it out. Okay, so do it. Adios. See you in the next clip with a couple of stories about how this has actually happened.